One. Okay, and we're live, and at this moment, the registry code 693024 should be working if you log in. You've had me for applying research. Some of you have had me for images of crime a bit so far. And today I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite figures in social thought, John Stuart Mill. Content warning, there's not too much that's too explicit, but there's going to be some depiction and discussion of violence, so bear that in mind. And I just thought while we put in the registration code, I just thought I'd tell you about one very common mistake, which I'd really appreciate it if you guys fixed in your various essays. It is, when it comes to John Stuart Mill, it is Mill, not Mills. Not Mills. Sometimes we say Mills because we're saying, oh, it's Mill's theory, as in, it's like a possessive. So sometimes people get confused and they go like, oh, it's Mills. No, it's not. It's Mill when it comes to this. There's another figure, Charles Mills, an important sociologist. So there are some Mills out there, but this is John Stuart Mill, the son of James Mill, a famous historian and economist. So just bear that in mind. Let me just double check that we are recording, and looks like we are. Good. Okay, so here's the outline. I'm going to talk a little about 19th century Britain. Empire, oppression, and slow liberal reform. I'm going to talk a bit about the personal and professional life of John Stuart Mill. I'm going to talk about Mill's intellectual context, the philosophical radicals. And then I'm going to discuss a little bit about Jeremy Bentham and utilitarianism. Jeremy Bentham arguably being the most significant of the philosophical radicals, apart from John Stuart Mill, if you want to put him in that category. And then I'm going to discuss a little bit about how John Stuart Mill made some variations, some criticisms and some variations on Jeremy Bentham's theory of utilitarianism, and how that looks a little bit more like what we would call today rule utilitarianism. Then I'm going to come to on liberty and the harm principle, which is probably what John Stuart Mill is most famous for today. Then I'm going to discuss a little bit about Mill's feminism, which was quite strident and strong, especially for the period in which he was active. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about Mill as a liberal imperialist, which is demonstrates that he has a very, very troublesome inheritance for today. And if I have a chance, I'm going to talk a little bit about his approach to economic theory. So the ways in which he was a capitalist, the ways in which he was a socialist, and how ultimately we might think of him as being a bit of a mix on that front. So what is going on in 19th century Britain? I think it can be summarized as imperialism abroad and oppression at home. So I want to kind of give you a little bit about the context about what we're dealing with, about what John Stuart Mill was dealing with. So we have to understand quite how violent and coercive the many policies were, and how kind of oppressive they were, throughout the 19th century, although with some hesitant reform along the way. So up until 1815, so that's just over 200 years ago, impressment was a legal policy, and that's forced service in the Royal Navy. It's a bit different from conscription, which we had, in World War II. You could be called up for office. At least that was done in a somewhat more organized way. This involved basically people roving around the countryside near ports, looking for people who might be sailors or who might know how to sail or who otherwise might not have anything else that they're doing in particular. And people think like, I don't know. I think these people might be more important on a ship right now. And then basically dragging them off and putting them in through some basic training and then sending them off on ships was also something that the Navy did on the seas. They would basically target merchant ships and just grab sailors off them and say, you're in the Navy now. And targeted vagrants and convicts in addition to merchant sailors. Deportation often to Australia, was widely used even for what we would consider fairly minor crimes. In 1819, there was the Peterloo Massacre, where 15 people were killed at a 60,000 worker protest about working conditions and the high cost of living. You might think about how that might reflect on some of the challenges we're facing today, although, of course, this was a much poorer country back then, a much poorer, much less developed country. The Peterloo Massacre and the protest got the elite very, very worried at the time. The government attempted to crack down on social reformers, the sort of people that were kind of organizing workers, by banning private weapons, drilling, that is weapons training, and freedom of association, as well as, interestingly, raising taxes on newspaper sales. And collectively, these various measures were called the Six Acts. Much of this legislation, to be fair, did not last very long, but it was an attempt to kind of permanently keep social reform at bay and to kind of keep workers under control. It's very, very curious. There's a whole bunch of people in the 19th century, the elite, who were trying their very best to make sure that a whole bunch of people never learnt to read. And one way of doing that was to basically crack down on newspapers and magazines, because people were learning spontaneously and trying to get themselves educated. And the elite thought this could be pretty bad for the country as a whole if everyone could read. So via various means, subsidies and taxes, they were trying to discourage people from doing that. Then the funny thing is things flipped, and from the 20th century onwards, the elite spent all their time trying to figure out how to get everyone learning to read. So they realized that this was, they decided it was in their interest to make sure that everyone had access to education, and then were very worried when people didn't have access. So it kind of shows how ideologies can flip, really remarkably quickly in historical terms. And until 1832, only 439,000 men in Britain could vote, and that's around 2.6% of the British population. And the right to vote was based on property holdings. In 1832, there was a big reform that expanded it, but not to everyone. It kind of expanded it, expansions happened progressively throughout the 19th century. And until 1870, women were unable to own property. And they weren't allowed to vote until 1918. So many of these reforms, they didn't all happen in the 19th century. They're coming over into the 20th century as well. Religious nonconformists, that is, people who were not members of the Church of England, were only allowed to hold public office from 1828 and only allowed to attend the ancient universities from 1871. So what I'm kind of trying to tell you here is this was a century of reform, but from a very oppressive standpoint. In other words, a starting point where women had very few rights at the beginning and some towards the end. And indeed, people who were not standing members of the Church of England had various public disadvantages. So jobs they were not allowed to hold, statuses that they were denied. That was in terms of belief, and also in terms of political participation. Political participation is restricted to property owners, so quite substantial property owners in the grand scheme of things, and various merchants and things. So in other words, political participation was not something that was universal. It was granted based on status. And I've got like a picture here of the Peterloo Massacre, because it was caused by a cavalry charge into the crowd. And here's the British Empire, which was still to grow somewhat, but was at a pretty, more or less, quite close to its height in 1815. So where does John Stuart Mill fit into this? So he lived from 1806 to 1873. He was born in Pentonville, now part of central London, and he was the son of James Mill, a Scottish economist and historian. He was educated intensively and apart from children his own age, with the intention of making him a genius and an intellectual leader. So he was learning ancient Greek from age 3, these sort of bizarre things that he was doing. He suffered a breakdown aged 21 when he started disagreeing with some of the ideas he had been taught. And, he was a religious nonconformist, so I mentioned in the previous slide, so he was not a member of the Church of England, and so he was unable to attend university. From 1823 to 1858, he worked for the East India Company, a corporation that controlled large parts of India with the support of the British government. In 1851, he married his intellectual collaborator, Harriet Taylor, who he attributed a great many of his ideas. And from 1865 to 1868, he was a member of parliament for the Liberal Party. So he was not just an intellectual, he was also an activist, an advocate, a very influential one. Now, John Stuart Mill was a member of a group of British intellectuals that pressed for social reform. Some of them became an important faction of the Whig Liberal Party in Parliament. That includes John Stuart Mill himself. And they were inspired by some of the ideas behind the French Revolution, which had happened late in the previous century, 1789. And that abolished the French monarchy and introduced a republic. And, hopefully you are aware of some of the ideas behind the French Revolution. One of the slogans is equality, liberty, and fraternity. So these are the ideas that were kind of inspiring the philosophical radicals. And they believed, among other things, that the state should support the interests and well-being of everyone and not just the elite. This was quite a strong, quite a controversial idea at the time. Although these days, if you speak to almost any mainstream member of a political party, they'll say, of course, the state should support the well-being of everyone. They just disagree about how. They were critics of natural law and divine theological justifications for the use of state power and of aristocratic privilege. And they campaigned for free trade. So in this sense, they were kind of, supporting what we might think of today as a capitalist ideology. But they also supported freedom of association, rights for women, and expanding the right to vote more generally. And I thought it was worth highlighting that, like the social reformers of today, maybe you might think of Extinction Rebellion just as an example, Mill and his allies were often satirized in newspapers and magazines, even though they supported virtually unlimited press freedom themselves. So, they were willing to take the criticism because they thought that it was important that these things be fought out. But many members of the press were not, like to kind of make fun of these reformers and thought they were kind of crazy, weird, and deviant, as any kind of radical social reformers are going to look like. So John Stuart Mill, as you maybe saw from the opening slide, he had quite a slight frame. He was sort of quite thin. He was also perhaps the most prominent supporter for rights for women and for the ability for women to enter Parliament. When people wanted to kind of attack him for that, what they did is they kind of sort of did cartoons with him dressed up in women's clothes and kind of made, that was how they thought that would be an effective response to kind of make fun of his of what they took to be a stereotypically effeminate figure. And they kind of contrast it with one of his figure with John Bright, who was one of his allies, who was also a radical reformer, but had a more, stereotypically masculine build. He's got a kind of more heavier set. And here is John Bright, making a few punches at aristocracy. So, this is part of their other thing, trying to remove aristocratic privilege. And bear in mind that at this time, the House of Lords and, of course, the monarchy exercised a great deal more political power as opposed to ceremonial power than it does today. So a great many of the things that they were in favor of have actually changed over the course of these things in their direction. Early on, they probably wanted to abolish the House of Lords. And I think that if you look at certain ideas in the Labour Party, that's still an idea that's sort of out there. But we're in the 21st century now, and the House of Lords still plays a relatively important role, although it's been reformed very substantially. So, giving a little bit more context, but now moving into the theories a little bit. Jeremy Bentham. So Jeremy Bentham, who lived from 1748 to 1832, was a central figure in the philosophical radicals, possibly an early figure, because he's the one who brings over many ideas from France, from French theory, and indeed a bit of Italian theory, and starts applying it to the UK. And he personally taught John Stuart Mill, so he was kind of acted as a tutor, as well as his father James Mill, who played a very, very big role in the Mill, these two Mill lives. He opposed slavery, the death penalty, and corporal punishment. In fact, rather progressively and like with a great foresight, he opposed corporal punishment not just for adults, which was very widely used at the time, but also for children. And if you think like even today, there'll be people who will say, okay, well, obviously we don't go around beating adults anymore, but maybe children, it's the only way of disciplining them. Whereas he thought it was wrong in general. It was whatever age. So he was a progressive in that sense. On the other hand, he developed a new prison design, the panopticon, of which I believe the name of these. This software we use to record these lectures, Panopto. I think they're kind of doing a bit of a wink and a nod to the panopticon when they decided to call it that. And that was supposed to use surveillance to rehabilitate people. And so he had this design that basically meant that you could have one warden set up in a watchtower, and they could observe anyone in a given division of the prison. And more importantly, the prisoners would not be able to tell who was being looked at. This was like the key element of the design. So in other words, you might be being surveyed, but you can't be sure. That's like the key idea behind the panopticon. So there's like a physical element to it, but there's also a theory behind it, that if people always know they're being watched, they're likely to behave better. That was sort of, so Bentham had lots of schemes and policies and ideas and designs that he was always trying to encourage the government to kind of get involved with developing. They did try building some prisons along this design in the United States. I'm not sure if we had one in the UK eventually, but it was quite influential in its own way. Just hide this so that, okay, just a reminder, 693024 for the registration code. Jeremy Bentham supported the foundation of University College London, and this was the first institution of higher education to allow women, Christian non-conformists, Catholics, Jews, and atheists to graduate with a full degree. So before then, you had to be signed up as a member of the Church of England. And he was a rather irreligious fellow himself. So in a kind of like attempt maybe to annoy some of the ideas of the time about the way that dead bodies ought to be treated, after his death, Bentham asked his body to be turned into an auto icon that is displayed today in UCL's Student Center. So actually, this is a picture I took just a few weeks ago, where I'm standing next to Jeremy Bentham on one of my trips down to London, because I always like to try and check in with him. And so bear in mind, he died nearly 200 years ago. So he's one of the few people working 200 years ago who you can still sort of meet. That's literally his skeleton under those clothes. So that's why it's an auto icon. And although it's a mask, his face didn't survive, sadly, over the years. It's a mask that's covering it, but his body, the remains of his body, are still there for you to go and view. So that will show you the kind of radical ideas and the kind of like the willingness to kind of transcend and move away from traditional norms that he was kind of illustrating even in death. Bentham formulated an ideological and philosophical doctrine, utilitarianism. And utility is simply the experience of pleasure and the absence of pain. The principle of utility states that good actions are those that contribute to the greatest happiness for the greatest number. And this means that both people and the institutions they establish, for example, the state, should have the overall aim of maximizing utility. So happiness is the overall aim. And this contrasts with theories that treat rights and duties as more fundamental than consequences, e.g., keep your promises, never lie, never steal, never kill. Those kind of things that are kind of rules that a lot of people think are very important. There's some criticisms here. It seems to require that happiness be both objective and measurable, a very positivist assumption, which hopefully you're getting from some of the other ideas that on this course so far. And also, it seems to assume that the interests of everyone can be accommodated, whereas Marxists argue that the interests of the working class are against those of the middle class and the capital-owning class. So, he'd be trying to find win-win solutions, ways of increasing overall average happiness. And one way of illustrating where utilitarianism has kind of moral bite is this rather famous thing. You can see this as memes on Twitter, on TikTok these days, because it's quite a fun kind of little thought experiment. But it's called the trolley problem. And there's loads of variations on it, but this is the classic one. 5 people are stuck on the track of an out-of-control trolley cart. And you happen to be by a lever, you're just a bystander, but you just happen to be by a lever when this situation occurs, that if pulled will divert the track away from the 5 people, but onto a path where unfortunately one person is still trapped. Do you kill one person to save 5 in this instance? A utilitarian will usually argue that you should pull the lever. But other moral theories would say it is wrong to deliberately sacrifice one person to save 5, and that you, the person by the lever, are not permitted to intervene, even if it will lead to a much better outcome. So I'm actually kind of curious, because this is one of the few questions that normally produce a little bit of a divide. So I'd like to have a very quick show of hands, and I'll just try and see who's the majority and who's the minority. Who would, in this particular scenario, so just bear in mind, you're a bystander, you have no idea how this situation has occurred, you know that it's either an accident or it's like some malicious person has done it, but the malicious person is nowhere to be found anymore. It's just a straight situation. There's no understanding about it's just where people have been placed. Who would pull that lever to save 5 people? Okay. All right, okay. And how many people would not? Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so the majority in this instance would pull the lever. So you're interested in saving on net 4 people, even if it means intervening directly and leading to the cause of somebody's death. Normally you get the opposite. Well, actually, you get a rather different approach if you use the same example of offering transplants in a hospital, where the institutional setting is very different. But some people who would refuse to pull the lever, there's good moral reasons for being against that as well. And the more examples you bring in, the more complicated it kind of gets. But for the raw example, most people tend to be a little bit utilitarian. So John Stuart Mill on utilitarianism. So Mill was a defender of utilitarianism, but also made some modifications to Bentham's position. Bentham thought all sources of pleasure were equal. Prejudice apart, the game of pushpin, which was just a silly game that people played in pubs, is of equal value with the arts and sciences of music and poetry. If the game of pushpin furnish more pleasure, it is more valuable than either. Mill argued instead that there were lower pleasures, which were often associated with physical sensations, and higher pleasures, and these were often more intellectual. And he said that it is better to be a human dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. Socrates being a famous philosopher, ancient Greek philosopher. Now, rather than focusing on individual actions that brought about utility, Mill tried to focus on general rules that would, by being repeatedly followed, bring about greater happiness. So, although breaking a promise or perhaps sacrificing one person might bring about utility in one case, so greater happiness for the greatest number, the general rule of keeping promises and not killing might produce more happiness overall. So that's sort of Mill's sort of variation on utilitarianism. So now let's have a think about Mill on liberty. So this is Mill's most famous work, and it was published in 1859. And in it, he introduced what has come to be called the harm principle. He didn't call it the harm principle, but other people have subsequently labeled it that way. The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant. Over himself, over his body and mind, the individual is sovereign. And he argues this on utilitarian grounds. So he's in making this argument, he is doing stuff that maybe Bentham would not quite agree with in some of the details. But the overall justification is very much in line with the sort of approach that Bentham was taking. The greatest happiness is found in people having the freedom to cultivate their own individuality through creative expression and experimentation. People need some space that society cannot enter. Now, it might feel like you can benefit people by, for example, forcing them to eat or drink a certain way, or decide what religion they should follow. But over the long term, it is better if people come to their answers through their own free will. That's the basic idea behind On Liberty. Now, what are the implications of the harm principle? First, freedom of private conduct. Whatever you do on your own or with other consenting adults is none of the state's business. Bearing in mind, Mill restricts this to people who are there because they want to be in that situation. He excludes pecuniary incentives. So if you're paying someone to come along and hear something, then the harm principle might allow some regulators to intervene. But if it's just people who are coming of their own accord without any particular monetary incentive, they're just coming along because they're interested, then they're allowed. Then you should be. Then the state should have no way of stopping them. He doesn't discuss sexuality in detail in the book. We know that Jeremy Bentham was in favor of the legalization of homosexuality, and we can be confident that Mill thought the same. And when I read these bits of On Liberty, I can't help but think he must have had something like this in mind, but he decided not to talk about it explicitly. But when he talks about things like experiments in living and the ability of consenting adults to be with each other, he's thinking about the whole range of activities that people might want to do on their own in private. It also includes freedom of thought and discussion. No one can police your thoughts. In addition, you should be able to read, watch, and listen to whatever you want. People should be free to say or publish whatever they want, so long as it is not libelous against individuals. So in other words, if you're saying terrible and offensive things and wrong things about an individual, then you might still be liable to be sued. Nevertheless, there should be no censorship, i.e., there should not be a government official reading or watching your content before you're allowed to publish it. So prior restriction is what he's against. In some cases, if you do publish something, you can be challenged on it later on if it turns out to be libelous, but there's quite a narrow range of reasons why you might be sanctioned for the kind of content that you produce, according to Mill. But according to the harm principle, you are still responsible for duties you have freely taken on, i.e., if you have children or dependents, you have positive obligations to look after them. The harm principle is not a kind of license to do whatever you want. If you've agreed to do something, then you can be held accountable for that. Commercial transactions are social and so can be regulated. For example, private consumption of alcohol is protected, but selling alcohol can be regulated. Though according to Mill, it should not be outright prohibited on paternalist grounds. So according to Mill, as soon as any part of a person's conduct affects prejudicially the interests of others, society has jurisdiction over it. And the question whether the general welfare will or will not be promoted by interfering with it becomes open to question. So there's a few things. What you do in private and what you say and publish, those things are protected. But other actions, they are, and potentially inactions, they are nevertheless subject to regulation. And this leads to some questions. Is the notion of harm too vague and ambiguous to tell when intervention is justified? What is meant by harm? Harm to others or harm to the interests of others? Can we agree on what constitutes harm, or does it depend on particular moral assumptions? Is harm the violation of another's rights? And can we agree on a set of rights? And what positive obligations do we have to each other as members of a society? Mill takes quite a strong absolutist position on freedom of speech here. He says that if all mankind minus one were of one opinion, mankind would be no more justified in silencing that one person who disagrees with everyone else on this one thing, than he, if he had the power, would be silencing mankind. So in other words, silencing one person because they are against the majority would be the same as if you were silencing the majority or silencing literally everyone else. If you think about the controversies about the sort of things that get published on Netflix these days. So I've got a picture of one of Dave Chappelle's stand-up events that will kind of show the degree to which Mill would support any opinion, no matter how unpopular. And the question is, can unpopular opinions be harmful, or how do we determine which opinions are merely unpopular and which are actively harmful? There's also a question over things like limits to privacy. So WhatsApp, which is owned by Meta, currently offers users end-to-end encryption across its network. This means that the only way to read the messages is to get hold of a user's phone. With a few exceptions, but generally speaking, if you're trying to crack an end-to-end encryption, you need to be on one of the ends. You need to have compromised one of the ends. Picking up the messages through the network is more or less impossible. Now, secure messaging is important for many users. It could be critical for someone fleeing domestic violence or people with families in oppressive states, for example, who want to be able to talk about the political situation there and don't want they might be in the UK, but they don't want their relatives in another country to be sanctioned. The UK government states that WhatsApp can be misused by terrorists and organised criminals, so they are demanding Meta create a backdoor that will allow them, basically our security services, so MI5 and MI6, into people's private messages. And WhatsApp have said that they will stop serving the UK before creating such a backdoor, as it will undermine their broader network. And so here, it's hard to say because, of course, this is very different technology to the sort that Mill was encountered. But I suspect he probably would have been on the side of people who want to keep these messaging services encrypted. So in other words, you have to use other ways of identifying offenders and criminals than poring over people's private messages. Back in his day, it would have been letters. So he would have said that you don't have the right to look through people's correspondence. You don't have the right to go and spy on people when they're having private meetings in the back room of pubs, that kind of thing. That's the sort of stuff that the Six Acts were kind of were trying to kind of undermine. And Mill was a big supporter of this freedom of association and especially freedom of private association and and of private correspondence. Here's another little challenge with dealing with the harm principle. So these days, economists will often point out that it normally takes two for harm to be kind of present. This is this kind of interesting notice kind of illustrates the challenge that many cases of harm and tort happen today. So here's a sort of a pub's polite notice: when leaving the premises, please remind our neighbours that drunk people have been loudly leaving this establishment long before they decide to buy houses next door to it. So here, pub goers have their freedom to enjoy themselves restricted if you if you introduce licensing requirements, but residents suffer harm from noise and disturbance. Now, the traditional common law solution is to ask who was there first, and now that's down to licensing. So here, the pub sign is kind of referencing an old common law solution, which says, look, whoever was there first gets prior rights. If you decide to build a house right next to an active pub, then, you should be aware that noise and nuisance are going to be part of it. But that means that if you owned a bunch of houses, or if you lived in a house and someone decided to suddenly to set up a pub, then you might have a legitimate complaint because you had no idea the pub was going to be there. Is that a fair solution? Is there a fair solution? It's very hard to make a principled decision without prioritizing one set of rights over others. Moving away from the harm principle, the subjection of women was another very important piece that Mill wrote. So subjection means putting someone under your control, and this can be a person or a country. And I thought it's worth noting that until 1828, when Mill was 22, petty treason was the offence of a wife killing her husband. And the label suggests that such an act paralleled a subject's attempt to kill or betray the monarch. The husband, up until then, was essentially the sovereign of his household. That was kind of the way that that was what that kind of label implied. And Mill directly challenged the common view that women were intrinsically, morally, and biologically inferior to men. Nature does not need man-made laws to enforce it, according to him. So if the difference between men and women are real, you don't actually need social laws to make or keep it so. In fact, he argued that it is the legal and political position that women are in that makes them act in a subordinate way. This is the 19th century when women can't vote and they can't own property. So they can work, but the money they're going to get, that's going to go to their husband. Mill's argument is simply that women should have the same legal rights as men. And he also thought that if women have economic independence, they will also develop social and intellectual independence. If both husband and wife have independent lives in public, then you don't have to worry so much about how they deal with each other in private, because both would have the ability to control or exit an unfair situation. So we have to think about, does that make sense? Radical feminists would say that this does not go far enough, although certainly it's better than the situation that in the 19th century that Mill was battling at the time. Now, there's an important link between the subjection of women and Mill's other liberal positions. When it comes to utilitarianism, Mill is saying that we cannot rule out something as wrong just because it has not been done or attempted in the past. We must always seek the greatest happiness for the greatest number wherever it leads. And so a lot of people who are defending the existing position of women in society said, this is just the way we've always done it. And Mill is saying, well, that's a very bad reason for having those rules. He places great emphasis on progress. So the right rules of society depend on the level of technological and, more importantly, moral development of that level of society. So more liberal and more egalitarian rules make sense for a country like England in the 19th century, even if they would not have worked in the past. He also has a notion of progress for individuals. Rules applicable to children are not suitable for adults, and mature, educated adults only grow with more liberty. So hence he's saying, a lot of people at the time would have put women and children in similar categories. And what he's saying is that's wrong, because children will grow into adulthood and women, girls grow into adulthood as well. And he also believed in individual self-reliance. It's good for people to earn their own living and look after themselves and not to be dependent if they're capable. And he believed that the vast majority of women were capable of being self-reliant. Now we have to ask, is Mill's feminism compatible with liberalism? So in 2018, residents of Sheffield successfully challenged the license of a lap dancing club on grounds of a public sector duty to promote equality. The campaign solicitor claimed this victory is a recognition of the very serious concerns about how strip clubs normalise the commodification of women's bodies. This is a concern about a commercial enterprise changing or reinforcing existing beliefs and attitudes. And so we have to ask, does Mill's commitments to women's rights contradict his liberalism? Because it would seem that private gentlemen's clubs, as these things are sometimes styled, would be protected as part of freedom of association. So if everyone's there, they might be allowed to do it. There might be some regulation because it's commercial, but an outright ban would seem to be against the Millian spirit, at least on some readings. And now we have to handle what exactly was going on with Mill and his career in the East India Company. So Mill was a loyal manager for the East India Company for much of his life. It was a private corporation originally established to monopolize the trade in spices in favor of British merchants. And it expanded to include many other commodities, many more commodities. It also participated in the global slave trade. And in the 18th and 19th century, it developed into a political entity that conquered large parts of modern-day India. And this was the case until later in the 19th century, actually until Mill was still part of it when when it was being wound down, when eventually the company was taken over and effectively nationalized, and British India became a fully fledged part of the empire. it subordinated. This is the corporation, the East India Company, subordinated local leaders, as is depicted in this picture, in this painting here, raised taxes from the territories it controlled, and enacted legislation thought to be social reform aimed at remaking India in the image of Britain, but without any civil liberties or any democracy, even the kind of limited democracy that was kind of slowly growing in Britain at the time. Now, Mill justified the company's actions on utilitarian grounds. Liberal imperialism and colonialism was a necessary step before a country could have individualism, liberty, equality, and democracy. So, in other words, he's saying India is going to get there. India is going to be free and independent, but just not yet. It has to go through this stage first. And this is a classic case of utilitarianism being used to justify bad actions, pulling the lever. It's kind of looks like it could be a bad action that have supposedly good long-term consequences. So it's the idea that the ends sometimes justify the means. Now, of course, there's very little empirical evidence today showing that being conquered by Britain is good for a subject people. So, we can do cross-country comparisons. We can look at how well countries are doing. There's no evidence out there that being subject to imperial rule has this substantial benefit in terms of social progress. Very often the opposite. So Mill was at the very least deluded in thinking that what he was doing was truly, could truly be justified on utilitarian grounds. I'd say at worst, you could say that he's self-justifying, a way of, making his living and of raising his status and personal prestige through basically managing barbaric colonial acts. So that's a terrible weakness of Mill's position. And utilitarianism here was allied with other ideologies. Utilitarianism wasn't the main ideology here, but, there was various forms of Christian imperialism and various other kind of theories of social Darwinism and other ideas that were used to justify British barbarism and white supremacy. So Mill was in that, despite being a philosophical radical at home, believing in equality for men, women, for believing in workers' rights and seeking for social progress at home, he's justifying all of this abroad and personally participated in it, as a worker for the British for the East India Company. So important to have that overall context. And I think the difference here is kind of if we think about the trolley cart example, where for sure that you can save 5 people, but it's going to involve sacrificing one person. That's sort of where utility is at its best, utilitarianism at its best. This sort of stuff is where utilitarian arguments are at their worst, because, it's very easy for people to self-justify being the one to pull the lever in a kind of metaphorical sense and engage in a barbaric act if you, on the basis, it's it's going to lead to some good outcome in the long run. That's the concern. So finally, Mill, capitalist or socialist? In his Principles of Political Economy, Mill argues against some utopian socialist ideas, such as paying everyone the same wage, on the basis that people need personal incentives to work. He refines a number of pro-capitalist arguments that you might also find in Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. It's Adam Smith I've got up on the frame here. So somebody who inspired a great deal of Jeremy Bentham and the philosophical radicals. He argues that the accumulation of capital is a key explanation for improvement of the general welfare. And this is when people save money rather than spend it all on their consumption. And then through banks, they invest it in productivity-enhancing goods, such as machinery, factories, and farming equipment. And this, over the long run, raises everyone's income because it means that every hour of labor produces more goods to trade. The total output of the country increases. This is something that Mill, believed, even to some extent, till the end of his life. But later on in life, Mill takes socialist ideas much more seriously. He does not support the state control of the economy, but he does believe that ownership should shift from landowners and individual capitalists to worker cooperatives and mutual associations. There aren't that many that kind of own large amounts of the capital structure today, but there are a few quite prominent ones. The John Lewis Partnership, for example, is a kind of worker cooperative. So they do exist, and they function rather effectively. He thinks that worker organisations will be more efficient, so if they're allowed to compete with private firms, they will eventually beat them. He didn't seem to be quite so right about this, because Sainsbury's and Tesco, they do basically as well as John Lewis and Waitrose, even though they've got private ownership and shareholder ownership, and one's got like mutual ownership. But at least they're kind of on a par. So you might overall say he was a liberal socialist, but not a revolutionary socialist. So here we are with the things to consider for if you're thinking of doing your essay, or perhaps doing some further work on John Stuart Mill. The core reading is on liberty, because this is the most significant. And I've got 5 minutes for questions if people want to, or if you want to quietly make a move out, that's also acceptable.
First one lecture is also an appointment.
Yeah.
So will it be available on Blogtalk?
It should be available.